So to our three panelists, I'd like to ask you all to give a 3 to 5 minute introductory comments on this topic. What are megatrends and what are they significant for business, society and for government in setting public policy? So perhaps, Catherine, you'd like to start.
So the megatrend that I've been intimately involved in is the trend of the Internet of Things. And for those people who don't know what the Internet of Things is, I'm going to start with the basics. Essentially, what it's about is connected devices, systems and services. And the backbone of the connection is the Internet. And it actually involves a variety of protocols, standards, devices and applications. So anybody who's wearing a Fitbit or something along those lines, that's pretty much what we mean by the Internet of Things. It's a disruptive technology, but it offers Australia huge opportunity in terms of economic benefit. And if we think about the application of the Internet of Things, so essentially it's the backbone of intelligent asset management, where we can actually make our infrastructure smart, our energy, our water, our transport and rail networks. It can make our buildings smart with things such as integrating building information modelling with building management systems, and that can happen in the background with this connectivity capability. We look at vertical industry productivity, so we can see how key industry sectors such as healthcare and transport can actually be transformed by better connections. And also cross-sectoral productivity in the areas of things such as smarter cities, and of course smarter cities is very topical at the moment. It's fabulous that we're actually moving forward on that. And the recent inquiry into smart farming by the House of Representatives Standing Committee also illustrated the significant competitive advantage that Australia has in adopting smart technologies to improve the agricultural supply chain. And of course, precision farming is one of those. What's important in precision farming, though, is you need the connectivity. So what's really interesting is things like low power, long range connectivity protocols are coming in which enable people to connect their small devices out in the field and connect to the satellite so farmers can go about their business. But what does this really mean? Why is it a trend? Well, it's actually been sized as a $11 trillion USD uplift in GDP, and that's by the likes of McKinsey and others. And Gartner forecasts that 6.4 billion connected devices will be used worldwide. What does this mean to Australia? We've actually sized it as a $116 billion opportunity for Australia, but that is only if we actually are increasing our current competitiveness. What's interesting about the conversation of the Internet of Things is it's not just technology vendors that have got on board with the Internet of Things. The European Commission has made IoT an essential part of their digital agenda for Europe. The US this year, in March, actually introduced the Developing Innovation and Growing the Internet of Things Act into the US Senate, which is incredible. That the Internet of Things, a disruptive piece of technology, is part of one of their country's legislation. The Singaporean government has also created the Infocom Development Authority, and what they're going to do is deploy an Internet of Things network. Now, what was the reason for them doing this? It was actually driven because they needed to address big challenges such as urban density, ageing population and skills for the future. So that's why it's really important. And we've actually been following the UK government's work in this space where they've allocated $73 million and rejuvenating and revitalising places like Bristol, Leeds and Manchester by deploying Internet of Things networks to support things such as smart cities and smart industry. So what's our response to this? Well, currently I'm very involved in the Internet of Things Alliance Australia. We actually formed that think tank 18 months ago because we were really at the risk of being left behind in this vision around the Internet of Things. And what we've done is we've set up 6 very active work streams that really highlighted the gaps in terms of Australia's conversation around this disruptive technology and how this is going to transform. And there is a parallel initiative, Industry 4.0, which many of the people in this room would be familiar with as well, which is basically advanced manufacturing and across processes as well. So for collaboration, what we're doing is really seeking engagement around how this can be part of the conversation of government and industry, and looking at targeted areas built on Australia's competitive advantage. For smart cities, which is the work stream that I lead in industries, we're focused on energy, water, transport, smart cities and agriculture. And we've recently also launched the Hypercat Australia standard, which was from the UK, which is trying to improve interoperability between systems and industry. There's also the open data and privacy. We don't need to look too far to realise that there are concerns with these technology and how we deal with that. And we're also looking at the way in which spectrum can be fairly allocated for the use of the Internet of Things. So just in closing, the Internet of Things is really important. It actually touches a broad range of portfolios from economic and regional development, industry, innovation, environment, and therefore I think it's something that we need to be debating and having more energy applied to for Australia as an innovation nation.
Thanks, Catherine. Terrific. I think 116 billion upside. We probably don't talk about it enough, given that's significant. So, Nicholas, maybe to turn over to you on that question. Where do you see these megatrends and the implications for us?
Okay, so I'm going to give myself 5 minutes. I've mentioned, I'll start with the agenda that we've just heard, not so much the Internet of Things, but IT generally, information generally. The 21st century has seen an explosion of new public goods. I wonder how many people know what I'm talking about. They weren't built by the government. They are things like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and they weren't all built for profit, but these are all public goods privately provided. Wikipedia is another one. So as we move into the internet age, or we've been in it for some time now, our public policy instincts are essentially all wrong. Because what we've been doing is the 80s and the 90s were all about cleaning away the detritus of 100 years of political favouritism and introducing much more rational market-based mechanisms. So should we build cars here? Let the market decide. What should this industry look like and so on? Let the market decide. The digital goods are always and everywhere a potential public good. Now, that doesn't mean that governments should build them. If governments tried to build Google, we wouldn't have got very far. But what we're looking at is a much more richer set of issues to consider, and we're not well equipped to do that. So that's my first megatrend. My second megatrend is secular stagnation. Virtually every discussion we have in Australia about how our economy is going begins not so much with what are the really big potential problems that we might face, but gee, isn't it good we haven't had a recession in 25 years. In the United Kingdom, where they had a bad crisis, we had a good one, of course, relatively speaking. In the United Kingdom, we have a central bank in which, in the middle of the crisis, the governor of the central bank, Mervyn King, said that of all the ways we could have constructed, all the forms of architecture we could have for banking, the one we've got right now is the worst. We still have that structure of banking. I'm not here to tell you I do have some horses in that race, but I'm not here to tell you that everybody else is wrong, just follow me, I've got the answer. What I'm saying is that the debate that we're having is very shallow indeed. Andy Haldane, my favourite public servant in the whole world, is the chief economist for the Bank of England, and every year has published an index of the implicit subsidy to banks from being too big to fail around the world. You know how much that is? More than all banks' profits around the world. At the moment, when I last looked, it was $300 billion. So there are plenty of things to think about. We're not thinking about them. We have, there is a general consensus in Australia that sitting on the cash rate as it is, we shouldn't cut the rate anymore. Now again, I happen to think we should, but I don't want to tell you I'm right and the Reserve Bank's wrong. What I want to tell you is that we're not having the debate. We have invented a new economic textbook, and this new economic textbook tells you something different to the one that I learnt and that is still taught at universities, which is that if your forecasts have slack in the economy rising and you have room to loosen policy, you should. We're not doing that. Do we have a new textbook? Well, not really. Do we have research papers coming out of the Reserve Bank of Australia setting out the costs and benefits of different alternatives and helping us debate these questions? Well, not really. I wasn't going to mention this, but I guess it's become more topical since we discussed this. I think we really need to talk about another megatrend, summarised in 2 words, Donald Trump. But what I mean much more generally is what I call vox pop democracy, the ability of whole nations to make decisions which educated people think are dead wrong. And I'm thinking of Brexit, I'm thinking of the fact that 40% of Americans will vote for a guy who's got no idea what he's doing, and you only have to tune in for 5 minutes to work that out. We led the world in that because we got rid of carbon pricing and replaced it with a cockamamie scheme for subsidising polluters to pollute less. You know, like if we have a drought, we subsidise people for consuming less water. Not. And I think there are actually things that we can do about this. It's a complex problem. There is a simple answer, which is to involve things like citizens' juries a lot more in our system of government. Just one fact for you. In 2010, there was a citizens' jury run on the question, should we have a referendum on leaving the EU in the UK? A Brexit citizens' jury. Going into the citizens' jury, 60% of people said yes. Remember, this isn't that we should leave the EU, it isn't Brexit, it is should we have a referendum on Brexit. 60% of people went into the citizens' jury believing that we should. 45% of people came out afterwards that we should. Do we believe in democracy? Do we think that we, the people, can work this stuff out? I think we can. Having had some exposure to this, I think we can remarkably well, but we have to try to bring democracy a little closer to what people think after they've had time to think, rather than what people think when we shove a microphone into their face, let them go on social media, watch a bit of news and then go into a polling booth. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Nicholas. So all about engaging people to make those wiser choices. And Stefan, I know that's something that Data 61 is all about, how to look at those future trends, risks and scenarios to help make those wise choices. So what's your opinion on the megatrends we face and what we can do about them?
Thanks very much. I think the Data 61 Insight team, we do work to flesh out what future trends are and scenarios, and we also do decision analysis and risk analysis to work out what's best to do. I'm just back from 2 weeks ago in Paris, actually, the OECD meeting, where it was the people who do my sort of work in strategy and foresight from across the OECD all shared their thinking on megatrends as well. So when we give a snapshot of the sort of material that was covered, I mean, the opening sessions were all very much showing us the data which we knew of, flatlining or declining productivity in OECD countries, the fact that some young people CPI adjusted earning less than their parents did in parts of Europe, that income is stagnating apart from some economies. It was all pretty glum news. It was what they refer to as a low growth trap that we seem to be caught in, and
I think that there is this overarching need for Australia, for the OECD, to kickstart the economy and reinvigorate where we are. And this is this notion of the innovation imperative. The fuel source for Australia's economy today is, it's not resources, it's ideas, knowledge, innovation, experimenting with new business models like we never have before. And we need to do this as the massive economies in our region are transitioning out of industrialisation into advanced service sector economies themselves. We've got to become an advanced service sector economy, and I think this thinking is across the OECD. We discuss the productivity paradox about, we've had all this digital technology since the late 80s and early 90s. Why has it not resulted in an improvement in multi-factor productivity? And that's debated, and I think the answer is we don't really know, other than quite possibly in the early stages of digital disruption, we see a lot of changing things around and restructuring, that people are having to change their careers, their jobs and careers, their education and training. Companies are having to restructure, governments are having to restructure what they're doing. And whilst we're resetting everything up for the digital economy of 2020 and beyond, it's not associated with strong productivity growth yet. But there's that debate is yet to be had. Clearly, though, the nature of what generates wealth is changing, and is changing considerably. There was a lot of thinking across the OECD on future workforce, future jobs, and a lot of concern about what jobs and incomes will look like, perhaps even more acutely. And I know CEDA's done some great work on it. We published a report called Tomorrow's Digitally Enabled Workforce, which argued that spreadsheets didn't kill off accountants. The smart accountants learned how to use them and got better jobs. And distributed ledger technology and blockchain, as it comes around the corner, which has the ability to replace any need for auditing. This is our main project we're doing at the moment for the Treasurer and Prime Minister, is to look at what blockchain does to the Australian economy. It can, peer-to-peer money lets me disintermediate a bank, and I think you mentioned the banking and financial sector. There are good reasons to see massive disruption in that sector as new technologies, billions and billions of dollars with double-digit % year-on-year growth in our region into financial services technology has to have some sort of impact. So that came up a lot too. I think the other thing, food and agriculture is a massive opportunity for Australia, which is in our Megatrends stories as well. Basically, when you get wealth growth in Asia, a new middle income bracket, you get health concerns as the obesity trends we've had in Australia are being replicated across Asia. Whilst it not in visual appearance, there is body fat close to body organs for them, which creates the same health risks. Plus the desire for provenance, where did my food come from, and safety concerns are all escalating. Mixed with digital technology, there's this massive opportunity for Australia and New Zealand. New Zealand are beating us, absolutely. I've been over the Tasman 3 times now to see how quickly and adeptly their agriculture is moving to capitalise on this, what they call high-value nutrition market. Australia's got to do the same because the market is real and massive, and digital allows us to close the gap between the Shanghai food consumer who's buying the tomatoes in the store and the grower in Victoria who made them, so they can see exactly where it came from and what happened on the way. That the ability to do that will be what allows us to connect to those markets. So we need to get moving on that front. We've also, aside to the OECD stuff, we've been previously in Singapore, and Data 61 is doing a lot in Singapore, and we're hugely impressed by what we see there. We also, we want to go there more. But we also are looking at a project on what we've termed sunrise industries. So we had a couple of sessions with A-Star, which is the CSIRO equivalent in Singapore. They have 5,500 staff. Now, Singapore built an airport and a shipping port back 40 years ago before Asia knew it needed one. They're now building knowledge economy capabilities like never before. They're investing heavily in Internet of Things. Already for several months now, you can get an automated taxi driving you around Singapore. But the next thing is sunrise industries. What are the new industries that are forming? Could it be fintech or high-value nutrition? And we're wanting to do joint work with them in that area to help Australian companies get pole position in these new industries. Wealth inequality and the geopolitical sort of destabilisation is increasingly featuring in our work too, I think. And the unusual stuff we've seen with unusual things going on the United States election, plus Brexit as well, has been on our agenda. The elephant graph is getting a lot of attention. I don't know if you've come across this. It's in the literature a bit, where the y-axis is percentage increase in your income over the last 20 years, and the x-axis is where you sit on the global wealth levels, so low wealth through to high wealth individuals across the entire world. And we see that low income countries have done very well. There's been sort of 20-30% increase in their income over the last 20 years. High wealth countries like Australia, though, the advanced OECD economies, the low to middle income bracket hasn't done well at all. It comes down to 0% for the last 20 years on average, until you get to the very upper echelons of wealth, the top few percent of our economies. Then it goes even higher than the developing world, to the most high levels. So that is often what is put up when there's a discussion about the US presidential election or Brexit, about this big part of our society that doesn't feel like they're connecting to the growth opportunity, which I think we're going to have to increasingly look at. Geopolitical risk is also very much there. We had some briefings from NATO, from the US National Intelligence Council, who produce a Megatrends report themselves, which will get tabled in December for the new incoming president. And we got a briefing from Israel too. And it's all not very optimistic outlooks for the world geopolitically. The things that we were told we could be sure of was continued terror threat and destabilisation events in the Middle East, and the likelihood of governance failure there ongoing. No reason for any change. The things that were listed as uncertain were China and the South China Sea, and the United States was put up there as an unknown based on the stuff that's going on, and also the sort of future for NATO and Russia were indicated as big concerns. So overall, the world has some challenging geopolitical issues ahead of it that aren't in any way trivial, and are likely to get more complex. And they're going to tax our decision makers and leaders to make smarter and smarter choices about how we play chess. So that's probably some of the main things that are on our agenda. I think we are wanting to improve our abilities to handle new and emerging risk. That was something else that maybe to look at, is distinct from a mega trend, which is a gradual change in the conditions around us. There's the possibility of sudden shocks that would happen to Australia. And I think at a high cross-sectoral level for emerging risk, we don't do that well. I spent a fair bit of time with the United Kingdom team that do have actually a risk register for the country, and they look at new and emerging risks which haven't formed or clearly become apparent yet. But yeah, the world we're moving into, it's apparent that the risks have multiple drivers, multiple policy solutions potentially, and are cross-jurisdictional in nature, and that's the sort of capability that we need to get better at managing. So I think there are big challenges in the stories, and as we do the next Megatrends report from my area in CSIRO and Data 61, we'll be thinking about these sorts of challenges, but we keep on landing on the innovation imperative across all those sorts of challenges in front of us. We're at a turning point in the history of Australia's economy where ideas and innovation are central to how good my two children, who are 6 and 10, so when they're trying to get a job, it's the quality of our ideas and innovation and how well we embrace all this. Digital technology is a springboard for us into the economy of 2020 and beyond, which we've got to jump onto.
Stefan, thank you. Certainly interesting times. I think we'd all agree with Yogi Berra when he said the future ain't what it used to be. Now, we've got time for some questions from the audience. Does anybody have a question for the panel? Please state your name, organisation you're from, and keep the questions as brief as you can. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Steve Harrison from the City of Adelaide. Internet of Things and big data and innovation, it sort of also depends on the fundamentals of our infrastructure. Our city's about to go into the throes of building a 10 gigabit capable network in our CBD, fibre to the premise. Just wondering what your thoughts are on where our infrastructure sits globally and the future of what we really need to do to make us competitive and connect to the rest of the globe.
So in terms of globally, not too well. The challenge we have in Australia is a lot of the connectivity is concentrated in cities. And so if we are to look at, for example, ambitions to develop, say, for example, Northern Australia around exactly what Stephen's talking about, food provenance and food safety, we've got to get better at getting connectivity, not just within cities, but also within peri-urban environments and also regional. One of the challenges also, but I think it's a great opportunity, is that we've got a fragmented communications industry in Australia, and that's been basically come out of necessity where there's been market gap. So essentially what happens is you get new entrants into the market, and then that of course builds out new systems and new capability for connectivity. There is no doubt we need fast broadband. I don't think you need any convincing around that. And countries such as Korea and Singapore are reaping the benefits of cohesive and comprehensive strategies around the backbone of fast broadband and the internet. And of course, once we then factor in things such as the Internet of Things, we're going to have to get very creative about the spectrum of connectivity capability and technologies to support that. So what I think is interesting is cities such as Adelaide. I know that you're going through that stage of getting some more fibre and connectivity, is that we also need to focus on supporting clusters. So for us to have an innovation imperative, we must activate industry and business also with connectivity. It can't just also into the homes. It has to enable that so people can have 24/7 capability. Look, if we track it, I can't remember the exact figures, but we're not good. In terms of OECD nations, where we sit in connectivity, we're actually falling behind. Having said that, though, I think that there is very strong interest from international players to actually sort of fill in some of those gaps. And in the Internet of Things, we're seeing really exciting technologies in this low power, long range connectivity, NB-IoT, which hopefully will abate some of those issues to be able to connect industry.
I think I'd agree with that too. I think we've just kicked off this project called QDIP, Queensland Digital Infrastructure Plan, where we are looking in Queensland for the gaps in digital infrastructure out to 2020. Forecasts of data demand are pretty obvious. They're just an exponential growth curve that we need another 75 metres on the y-axis to finish that forecast graph out to only 2025. Lots more data will move, and it's fundamental architecture for the knowledge economy we need to have. We've got this tyranny of distance issue. We've also got really bad information on the data transmissivity across the country and the compute, the sort of distributed compute power that exists across the country, and that's what we're trying to tackle. Queensland is the first state that I'm aware of to have an explicit digital infrastructure plan which looks for gaps and opportunities to fill them, and then we need to start prioritising. We also need research that gives us 5G, 6G, 7G and a range of technologies that allow us to overcome tyranny of distance in moving data around.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? One over here, I think.
Thank you. Russell Mason from Suncare Health and Wellbeing Services. Stefan, we talk a lot about the technology and the actual IoT. It's all wonderful. But what about the population and the take-up and the culture of embracing it? Singapore has embraced it. Even in the UK, I was there last year, and in places like Denmark, they've embraced it. Here we talk about it a lot, but we don't actually seem to be really embracing it.
Yeah, I think a lot of our focus is shifting away from the boxes and wires of digital onto the actual human factor, the governance systems and how people think about it, and the headset we have. Colleagues of mine at QT refer to the digital mind that we need to start to imbue into people. We do have to tackle it. We have to have, there is a requirement for the sort of increased entrepreneurialism. So our work on tomorrow's digitally enabled workforce pointed towards, one of the megatrends there was porous boundaries, the disappearance of boundaries around yourself, your company, your organisation, your country, as digital allows a lot more information to flow in and out, and labour markets become a lot more agile and flexible. The possible rise of the peer-to-peer economy is there, and the need for increased entrepreneurialism. Our kids don't just need to, they do need to improve digital literacy. Victoria and Queensland are the only two states that have coding formally on the curricula for schools, and it should be everywhere, from prep up to grade 12, so that when you come through grade 12 you have coding. We need cybersecurity training much more than we have. They'll face increased cybersecurity risk of new forms by the time they're graduating. We've got to lift that. But digital literacy, I think, is table stakes to being able to operate into a new economy. The best jobs and most interesting jobs with good pay rise typically had the elements of creativity, complexity, judgment, social interaction was there, and I think vital for my two kids. They can't show up at CSIRO and get a job because it doesn't exist. They've got to make their own job. And they need entrepreneurial capabilities to do that, like Catherine's got. Yeah.
Actually, thank you, Stefan. But what I'm intrigued at is actually I was speaking at the TAFE Directors Conference in Melbourne last week. I don't know if any of you were there, and I presented on future skills, where we actually tracked the 10 fastest growing industries globally and where those skills sat. So if we look at the 10 fastest growing industries globally, they are in, interesting enough, cybersecurity and surveillance. They're in food provenance and safety, and obviously smart food. They're in actually automation and robotics. They're in connected healthcare. Industries that Australia, from a skills base, are really, really well positioned to do well in. And what I'm really encouraged about is I was in Launceston last week, and there's a company there called Definium who's actually doing advanced manufacturing and devices for the Internet of Things. And so what we're seeing is that in small pockets of the economy are these artisan electronics, engineering type outfits that are, focusing very much on global markets. So I appreciate your comment that, and that's why the Internet of Things Alliance Australia, that's why we created a community, because we wanted to do something and showcase that. So to that end, we're actually kickstarting IoT demonstration projects. They have to solve a problem, and they've got to be collaborative, and so you'll hear more about that. And in the cities piece as well, we've been working very closely with Assistant Minister Angus Taylor to embed the principles of interoperability and data into the Smart Cities and Suburbs program. So hopefully you'll start to see some action. But this has been very much industry, ecosystem-led, not relying on government to come up with the answers, because we can't wait for that. And the reality is government's important as an enabler, but it's about the get going and doing.
I think it's important to distinguish between hardware and, well, we call it software, but it's, wetware and institutionware and all those kinds of things. On hardware, it's just been a debacle. It goes back to a fight between Kim Beazley and Paul Keating about what was then Telecom, and how it was going to be broken up, and then we got two cables down half of Australia's streets and no cables down the other half, and it's kind of been that way ever since. So that's hardware. I think hardware is actually less important than the other stuff. For instance, we talk about e-health a lot. Now we have we might have pretty poor hardware in lots of ways, but and better hardware would help with e-health. But the main things to do with e-health are basically IR issues to do with the doctors' union called the Australian Medical Association. This is how we handle these kinds of questions. We handle them as political stoushes. And it's absurd that we don't have an evidence-based way of deciding whether nurses should be able to administer injections to people, whether IBM's Watson shouldn't do the screening of people going to a GP, whether we should have decision support. We haven't even begun the conversation. So those are the things which, in terms of our self-image as being really pretty good at reform, and we were very good at stroke of the pen reform, the more I look at it, and by stroke of the pen reform I mean, is regulating shopping hours a good idea? No, let's get rid of it. We were good at that. Are tariffs a good idea? No, let's get them down to 5%. We were good at those things. We also thought we were good at utility reform, but we weren't good at utility reform, because utility reform isn't about should this be private sector or public sector. It's about the interface between public and private considerations. And we're awful at that. Now, I do emphasise most other countries are awful at it. Some of them are quite a bit worse than we are. But these are really hard things, and in many ways we talk about the wrong thing. How often do you hear a discussion about e-health not being about the pipes, not being about how terrific it would be if we could get broadband to everyone? Well, that's really probably, that might improve things by about 10%. Actually having a responsive, evidence-based, institutional reformation. I'm not saying, we just go in with a Productivity Commission inquiry and then make a whole bunch of rules. It has to be an evolutionary thing which deals with all these things on their merits, and we're a million miles from that.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, and that's table 3 down here.
Jagdan from Telstra, and look, I put my hand up to ask this question before Nicola started talking about hardware and infrastructure, and I'm going to stay right away, far away from it, and ask a question about the human capital. So we talked a lot, and we're talking a lot about the fact that we live in a time of change and how this is affecting everyone and how this is a good thing. By the same token, we have, our neighbors in China and others producing a whole more graduates than we are and a lot more smart quantity than we are. So, there is an issue around the size of the capability upcoming in our market. At the other end of the scale, we have a lot of people going through change in their own industries, kind of more mature capabilities that we need to transform and progress. And all over this entire spectrum of demographics, we have the issue of social inclusion. So how do we deal with it as a jurisdiction, as a country, as an economy?
Excellent. Who'd like to have a go at that one?
I'm happy to start. The OECD actually did a brilliant report on digital disruption and skills of the future, and it goes into details around adjustment, which is not just an Australian issue, it's a global issue. And the learnings from that were that we are going to go through a massive phase of readjustment, there's no doubt about it. But it's too early to think the doom and gloom about potential future skills. In terms of human capital, the things that we need to focus on in this nation is skills. And it's about the fact that it's not size that matters. I mean, yes, in terms of population, don't get me wrong, we're a small country, but we actually, if we put our minds to it, can punch way above the weight in terms of being able to deliver benefits and services. It's more about the skills of the human capital that's really important, and that's where we need to spend our energies. We need to really focus on what curriculum we're teaching in schools, and I'm working in a number of areas around trying to also bolster TAFE education and those sorts of areas around hard skills that can move into industry. And it's also about collaboration. It's about opening up our minds to what other nations are doing to bolster their human capital skills and leveraging that in an Australian context, which is locally delivered but globally also outlook. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think it's a combination of skills, adjustment, and being open to the fact that we are going to go through a period of massive transformation, and we can't think about what we did in the past. We've really got to think about, do we have... So when we track the fastest growing industries, what are the skills that we need, both soft and hard skills, around those things? So it's not just hard skills in engineering, it's soft skills also around risk-taking and entrepreneurialism as well.
So you may be aware that my company Lateral Economics partners with Fairfax every quarter to release, after the national accounts are released, the HALE index, the Herald Age Lateral Economics Index of Wellbeing. That way we do that is we start with the national accounts and then we manipulate them in ways that we think the GDP doesn't reflect total economic and social well-being. Now, when you start doing that, you think, well, one of the things GDP doesn't do is it doesn't distinguish between $1 spent on buying a television set and $1 spent on upskilling yourself. If you do that, you suddenly, I mean, it was a sort of a bit of a shock to me. I should have really known, but it's a reflection on our debate generally. What we think of as capital and what appears as capital on our balance sheets is of the order of $4 to $6 trillion in a $1.7 trillion economy. Human capital is $17 trillion. Everyone in this room is walking around with $1 million or more of human capital. Now think about the debate that we might have, what the BCA might say about what matters, and they'll tend to talk about things which are bugging CEOs at the time. And I'm thinking of things like workplace relations and so on. I'm not saying they're right or wrong about their position about workplace relations, but guys, and it is mostly guys, it is nothing compared with human capital. The other thing is that some human capital is taught in schools. About half of it is taught in families, that is non-cognitive skills, about half the most important part of human capital, and a lot of it is taught in businesses. How do we get businesses to impart human capital well? Well, they're doing their best, but let me get back to what I started about, talking about information. In this room, in the 2020 summit, I took a proposal to the summit, which got up, which ended up being called Windows on Workplaces, and it goes like this. Any business over 100 employees in Australia will be surveying their workers on what they think of their job, what they think of how well they're managed and so on. Wouldn't it be nice to have a look at that data? Well, we all know why we can't look at that data, because businesses don't want to release it. That's not a complete answer to that question, because why don't good businesses release that data? I think the answer is because there's no standard to release the data to. So if you release your data, somebody else can release their data, and they can release it in such a way that no one can tell who's better. So that leads to a low-cost, exciting idea, which is what I brought to the summit, which ended up being called Windows on Workplaces, which is, why don't we try to partially agree on some partial standard against which those things can be measured, and then people will be free to publish them. The ABS can do a survey to work out where people are in the scheme of things, and that could give us a market in quality management of people. Costs next to nothing. Might be an interesting thing to think about.
Thank you. Got to bring things to a close.